Hey everybody, Robert Nicholson here, president of the Philos Project. Very excited to be here with two friends of mine, two friends of Philos, to ask and hopefully answer a very important question, and that is, what is freedom for? Sohrab Ahmari, Stephanie Slade are here to talk about that topic, and for us at the Philos Project, this is our very first event in our offices since COVID. So apart from the question, which is very important, this is a very exciting time for us. But for us at the Philos Project, the question itself is extremely important. For those of you who know us, you know that our mission is to promote positive Christian engagement in the Near East. And of course, in doing that work, the question of freedom comes up all the time. These two friends of mine were on some of our Philos trips, fact-finding trips, to visit the Near East. Stephanie Slade came with us to Israel and the Palestinian territories in 2019. And Sohrab Ahmari came with us to Egypt in 2019 as well, I think. And both of those trips, of course, were focused on looking at the geopolitical situation, looking at the humanitarian situation. We spent a lot of time looking at the plight of minorities, especially Christian minorities, living in these countries, and along the way we're always dancing around the question of freedom. And obviously in the Near East, to ask that question necessarily implies other questions, questions about culture, questions about religion. What does freedom mean in the context of tradition? Sohrab has recently wrote a book displayed right here in the Philos office called The Unbroken Thread. And this book, as I understand it, is about answering these questions from a place of tradition, trying to understand and interpret the current moment that we're in here in the US and around the world in the context of those who came before us. Sohrab is going to talk to us about that book, going to talk to us specifically about freedom, his view of freedom. And to respond to him, we've invited Stephanie Slade, the managing editor of Reason magazine, who shares Sohrab's Catholic faith, but has a different view, I think, of what freedom means and wants to unpack it here for us. We're going to have Sohrab speak for about 20 minutes. Slade will speak for about 20 minutes. We'll have a little conversation, a little question and answer from our studio audience, and then we'll finish up after that. Very glad you can all be here. Sohrab, I want to turn to you first and ask you this question. What is freedom for?
Well, I want to thank the Philos Project for inviting me to do this event. Philos also helped launch my previous book. In fact, my first launch event was right here in this space as well. And I'm especially grateful for Philos's George Cross for conceiving of this discussion in the first place. I should note that I'm a member of Philos's advisory board, and I urge everyone who is here and also those watching remotely to support and explore the organization's important work fostering serious American Christian engagement in the Near East. Thanks also to Stephanie for joining us today, and this despite the fact that I didn't write an essay denouncing Stephanie Sladeism. And I won't do that. I'd like to begin by telling you a bit about my new book, The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos, and specifically my motivation for writing it. And then that will naturally lead us to the substance of today's conversation. So as most of you know, The Unbroken Thread is a book I wrote for my son, Maximilian, as a sort of intellectual bequest. The Unbroken Thread is for a son who is named after St. Maximilian Kolbe, the great Polish Franciscan friar who famously laid down his life for a stranger at Auschwitz and was canonized as a martyr in 1982. I was about to be received into the Catholic Church when I first heard the story of St. Maximilian, and once I did, I couldn't get it out of my system, and I mean that in a good way, and I felt I had to do something with it. And what I did was to name our first child after him. The naming was, to my mind, an act of tethering. I wanted to lasso my son amid what we can all agree is a disordered and often chaotic world and civilization, and tie him back to the sacrifice of his namesake. and also, importantly, to the spiritual foundation and intellectual formation that made that act of sacrifice possible and sensible. I'm anxious that unless its centrifugal impulses are counteracted, our civilization will deform my Max and make an ordinary life of Christian virtue, let alone the sacrifice of a Maximilian Kolbe, that this great act of Christian freedom, insensible to him, illegible to him. As I write in the book, Kolbe's account of freedom differs sharply from what our contemporaries take that word to mean. Our modern account of freedom reduces it to the mere ability to choose from the widest range of contraries or options. I can wear blue shoes, I can wear brown shoes. The more unrestrained I am, especially by tradition or religious authorities, the freer I am. Whereas the classical and Christian traditions, the church's great synthesis that built the West, define freedom as the liberty to do what one ought to do. And that meant, above all, self-mastery. The term self-government thus meant, first and foremost, government of the self, detachment, control over base appetites, a life of virtue, which crucially means accepting various natural and traditional limits that guided and formed traditional peoples. Kolbe, of course, took this vision to its Christian summit, thrown into a situation in which his ability to choose was narrowed almost to non-existence. Nevertheless, he chose to deny himself at a decisive moment, even unto death, to climb up to the cross, and in so doing, to radiate what it means to be truly human into that pitch-black void of inhumanity that was a Nazi death camp. I pray that my Max will never have to face such a situation, please God, but it would be enough from my paternal point of view if he can just live an ordinary life of virtue and true freedom. My nightmare, as I describe it in the book's introduction, is that he will inherit his parents' elite status, but live a life of purposeless decadence, seeking after self-gratification and merely getting ahead, keeping his options open throughout his life, as our culture teaches him to do, and as a result, never irrevocably binding himself to anything greater than himself, whether that's Christian union and marriage, or a religious vocation, or whatever that might be. He would never actually exercise his freedom because his primary prerogative is to just keep his options open. These are the fears that prompted me to write this book, and in response, I decided to write him a book of questions, 12 unasked questions, each of which pokes holes at our liberal technocratic certainties. I explore each of the questions through the life of one great thinker, the 12 taken together, offering a wide range of traditions, plural, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Confucian, pagan, even feminist. As disparate as these traditions may appear, each chapter demonstrates the working out of the same strange paradox, namely that we are made freer and more humane by adherence to various limits and restrictions imposed by nature and tradition, whereas, paradoxically, the abolition of those limits leaves us less free. Thus, for example, the relatively recent loss of the Sabbath as an institution has left American life more harried and miserable than ever before. Gender ideology's drive to defy sex as a natural embodied reality threatens women's position in society and leaves the modern subject miserably at war with nature. The irrational lengths we go to avoid death as a natural barrier has resulted paradoxically in angst-ridden lives and suffocating COVID restrictions, an issue on which I think Steffi and I would no doubt agree, albeit for different reasons. Now we get to the heart of our discussion. Having read some of her work, including those that have an autobiographical dimension, I think it's safe to say that Stephanie, too, decries many of the cultural phenomena that I describe. She's written perceptibly about atomization, the problems like low rates of marriage and family formation, etc., etc. Her diagnosis may be a little bit less dire, but the difference is a question of degrees and not quality. But she obviously, bottom line, does not deny that there is a cultural crisis. The only difference between us has to do with whether Christians should use government power to attempt to rectify the situation, to build or rebuild some of the limits that have been lost, and to proactively help Americans live more virtuously, to help them discern true freedom from its counterfeits, to bring themselves into conformity with natural law, and to create conditions that make it easier for ordinary people to live Christian lives. Stephanie would say, I think, that she too would wish for some of those limits to be restored, for a more wholesome society and a more virtuous citizenry. But she would be quick to add that such a society and such a citizenry should be brought about through the work of churches, civil society, and other private actors, through preaching, evangelization, and moral exhortation, community building, and so on. This, I believe, was the upshot of her recent essay on fusionism of a few months ago. And she believes that Christianity itself commands such a posture, since she, as she wrote a few years ago in response to my famous essay about David French, that my position, which is that the state has an eminent role in promoting Christian virtue, is fundamentally not Christian. And here's how I would like to define the debate. I don't think that I could ever persuade a committed libertarian like Stephanie to rethink her first principles on this question. It isn't going to happen, and so I won't try. What I would like to do, rather, and I'm convinced that this is a more productive use of our time, is to show that my position is the one that is consistent with the thrust of Christian political thought and practice as they existed for the better part of 2 millennia. In other words, historic Christianity, including, I would say, classical confessional Protestantism, but even more so Catholic legal and political thought, and of course the Church's magisterium, emphatically insist that the state has a role in promoting virtue, self-mastery, and self-limitation that is true freedom, and in promoting the common good, which must needs ultimately include a society that gives God his due, as St. Augustine insisted in The City of God when he criticized pagan Rome and suggested that its commonwealth wasn't a true commonwealth because it didn't give credit to the one God. What I'm suggesting in sum is that the Christian libertarian position is out of tune with Christian history and the full weight of Christian authorities. And let me try to demonstrate this with 3 general lines of argument. First, Christianity, historic Christianity, took for granted that private exhortations to virtue aren't enough. And this we find summed up most succinctly, as one usually does, in St. Thomas Aquinas. In the Summa, in the first part of the second part, question 90, article 2, the angelic doctor says, quote, "A private person cannot lead another to virtue efficaciously, for he can only advise, and if his advice be not taken, it has no coercive power, such as the law should have, in order to prove an efficacious inducement to virtue, as the philosopher, that is, Aristotle in Book 9 of the Ethics, says. But this power is vested in the whole of the people or in some public personage to whom it belongs to inflict penalties," end quote. Private exhortations to virtue are good, to be clear. But again, as St. Thomas says, echoing Aristotle, they're not enough. Formation of people requires authoritative discipline, even more so if you take into account the fall, which Aristotle didn't because he didn't have the benefit of revelation. Yet the philosopher, as St. Thomas always describes Aristotle, nevertheless taught that coercion is a constitutive element of a virtue-promoting law, and indeed that the lawmaker's principal duty is to form a virtuous citizenry, since virtue leads to true happiness. St. Thomas merely incorporated this basic Aristotelian teaching into his synthesis of Christian political and legal thought, and the Church has never abrogated its virtue ethics, its Thomistic virtue ethics, and therefore virtue politics, if you will. You will find it throughout, for example, the 1992 Catechism. Second, I would argue that historic Christianity accords conscience rights maximal reverence and respect, provided we define conscience correctly. Conscience, as the Church has always taught, is not just the mere dictates of whatever I feel like internally, but it's conscience only insofar as it reflects the dictates of an objective moral law. Therefore, when an authority helps to form a conscience, including through legitimate coercion, it is not violating the conscience, but rather it is being a friend to the true conscience. The idea that there is, for example, a conscience right to Satanism would be ruled out because that's in tension with the fundamental moral order of the universe and be a violation of the true conscience, and no true authority can tolerate that. This is the teaching of St. John Henry Newman in his famous letter to the Duke of Norfolk, where at the time he was accused, and as with all Catholic Britons, accused by liberal Britain, and especially the liberal Prime Minister Gladstone in the 19th century, of the fact that the existence of authority, including papal authority, meant that Catholics couldn't think for themselves. And John Henry Newman says, the definition of conscience that you have, meaning you liberals, where you think that one person might think that child sacrifice is okay, and another person might think that it's not okay, and no one can quite decide which of the two consciences is in the right, that's not true conscience. That is not conscience as it was understood for the 1800 years prior to this new definition of conscience. And the third thing I would say is I think there's a great concern among people like Stephanie about what you would call the mingling of the kingdoms. It's true our Lord says, render unto Caesar, but render unto Caesar doesn't mean abandon the faithful to Caesar's worst depravities. The idea that, for example, the gospel seed could fall among thorns and some gospel seed will wither doesn't mean we should tolerate a civilization that has been turned into a bed of thorns in which pornographization and all sorts of threats to the moral formation of children are tolerated in the name of the fact that some seed might fall among thorns. The idea that my kingdom is not of this world doesn't mean that that kingdom that is not of this world isn't superior to this world, and that therefore there is a right duty commanded by reason and revelation to order this kingdom to that kingdom as best we can. So what's my vision? My vision is the vision of historic Christianity. That I would argue that the faith became more fully itself after the Constantinian conversion, when the ordinary Roman citizen, thanks to the fact that the faith was recognized as legal and then the official religion of the empire, could worship freely without fear of persecution. And he may not have been, that ordinary Roman, necessarily the most faithful in the sense that he knew what every article of the creed meant, but he benefited from efficacious sacraments. He was in a new moral order that didn't leave children to be exposed if they're unwanted, and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, the faith became more fully itself because it became a mass religion rather than a religion for a spiritual elite. The ordinary person should be able to live a virtuous and faithful life. That's what my concern is for my son. And I think it's wrong to say, well, if your faith isn't strong enough if you can't go through this gauntlet that we've built as a society that at every step threatens your virtue, threatens your ability to adhere to the teachings of the church, and say, unless you can do that, you're not fully Christian. That actually is a form of Pelagianism. It's an echo of the great heresiarch of the late antique period, who taught that you can achieve perfection on your own and you didn't need a kind of an institutional support structure. Neo-Pelagianism might be this idea that it should be only your private will, you're only as a private actor, you should try to adhere to the faith, and therefore you shouldn't seek authoritative supports as have existed for most of historic Christianity. So in short, again, I can't bring Stephanie over to my first principles, but there's no serious reading of her principles that would be consistent with the thrust of historic Christianity and the living tradition of Christian and legal thought. So I'll stop there, and thank you all.
Thank you, Sohrab. That was great. That was quite the tour de force. Two things. I love that you wrote the book the way that you wrote it to your son. As a father, that resonates with me, and I think it speaks to something that is unique to people of faith, and that they see themselves as some kind of links in a chain, right? We are part of something much bigger than us. It's not just me kind of acting in the world. I have children. I had parents. They had parents, right? There's something surrounding me, a context that matters to my engagement with the world.
Ordered continuity.
Ordered continuity. Well, I could have just said that. That's much simpler. But the second thing is, and this is where I want to turn to you, Stephanie, is really the historic Christian angle, right? And that's what makes the Philos Project unique. That's what makes this conversation unique, is that we're taking sort of a current debate, a philosophical, a social debate, and we're talking about it, but we're also bringing in the Christianity. We're bringing in our faith tradition, and I think you're making a fairly bold claim, Sohrab. You're saying that the things that you're writing, the things that you're saying are consistent with historic Christianity, and other approaches are effectively not, right? And I started talking about the Near East. Obviously, for me, dealing in many of the countries that we work in, we're thinking about Islam and what Islam has to say about the common good, right? And it's, of course, different from Christianity in many respects. But here in this country, a majority Christian country, a country that is by itself already going through all kinds of social and political change, the question of Christianity does matter. And so I'm glad that we can talk in those terms here as fellow people of faith. So, Stephanie, Sohrab laid down a few challenges there for you. You're coming at it from, I think, what's sort of understood to be a Catholic perspective, but uniquely libertarian in a sense. What would you say to the arguments that he's making?
Thanks, Rob, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm especially happy that we settled on this particular topic because I think that starting any kind of conversation like this by defining terms is extremely valuable, and not necessarily because it will show that our disagreement is entirely semantic. I think sometimes when you define your terms, it actually can throw the disagreement into sharper relief, but that is valuable. There's value in that. And freedom is a word that has an awful lot of meanings. I mean, FDR during the New Deal era famously talked about freedom from want, and that was implicitly and explicitly a justification for him and for his supporters for aggressive wealth redistribution measures, right? Meanwhile, a free market type would look at those same New Deal policies and see them as violations of freedom, of economic freedom, of private property rights, for example. So right off the bat, we have two conceptions of the word freedom that are quite clearly contraries. And understanding what someone means when they say freedom is going to be really important because it's going to give you a lot of insight, and they could be coming from a lot of different places. There is also an understanding of freedom that I think is quite psychological. It is an idea, think about how we talk about addiction as something that keeps a person in chains. And if you overcome addiction, you're said to have been freed from it. You are sort of free to say no to the thing, the substance or the action that had previously kept you captive, right? That's a type of freedom. And if you broaden that concept out, I think you get something quite similar to what Sohrab has been talking about here. It's, you might say, a person is really free if they are free to say no to anything that is not of God. You're free to do God's will. I think that is a really fair and legitimate definition of freedom, but I don't think it's the only one. I think there is a more basic understanding that most people have of what it means to be free that is not the opposite of sin in that sense, but rather the opposite of coercion. If to overcome addiction is to be liberated from your chains in a metaphorical sense, I'm talking about being literally set out of your chains. If somebody is released from prison, if somebody, they're freed, right? They're set free. If you have the abolition of a law that previously prohibited you from engaging in a particular activity, could be something like worship or it could be something else, you've been freed to engage in that activity now. That's freedom too. And we are here in this room right now in person because the state of New York and the city government has decided not to enforce lockdown measures that would prohibit us from being here together. Right? And after the last year that we've all just lived through, I think we shouldn't be taking for granted that this is a true kind of freedom as well, because which is not me passing any kind of judgment on any particular restriction, COVID-related restriction, whether it was worthy or wise, but rather there was a live question that many people faced at various points over the last year about whether they were free to leave their homes, free to gather and to associate, right? Free to operate a business. I have with me a copy of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's first novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which I brought in part because I thought that you might mention it during your talk because you write about it in your book. It's his first novel. And in my copy, there's a foreword in which the writer notes that it almost wasn't published because he was still living in the Soviet Union at the time that he wrote it, and the Soviet government tried to censor it. And so Solzhenitsyn's editor appealed directly to Khrushchev and asked for basically him to overrule the censorship board. And the writer of the foreword writes, Khrushchev was only half-heartedly a liberal, and even then only when the mood struck him. But he happened to catch him on one of his liberal days and one of his liberal moods, and so Khrushchev okayed the publication of this novel that gave the world a glimpse into what life in the gulags under the Soviet Union was like. And thank goodness for that. I have another definition of freedom that I wanted to share because I think it highlights a particular disagreement or difference between the types of freedom the things that we mean when we talk about freedom. Quote, freedom is the power rooted in reason and will to act or not to act, to do this or that, and so to perform deliberate actions on one's own responsibility. And what I want to draw out of that definition is that you can see right there that this is not a type of freedom that is contingent upon you using the freedom to do the right thing. All the options are available. You can act or not act. You can do this or that. And this or that may not be in accordance with God's will, but this kind of freedom means that you can make that choice for yourself. And that, by the way, did come from the 1992 Catechism of the Catholic Church. Okay, I'm not saying here that my freedom that I've just articulated is the only kind of freedom, and I'm not even saying that it's the most important kind of freedom, and in fact, I think for the duration of this argument, it might be helpful if we referred to Sohrab's freedom as high freedom, and my freedom as low freedom. Freedom from sin, freedom to do God's will is the higher freedom. Freedom from coercion is a lower kind of freedom. But it's still freedom. It is still an understanding of that word that is important to have that concept in our vocabulary. I'm not saying that mine is the only kind of freedom or the most important kind of freedom, but what I am going to say, and here's my sort of bold claim, what I am going to say is that low freedom is the only kind of freedom that the state should be concerned with. That the state's job is to protect our low freedoms, and that it is our job, each one of us, individually and in association with each other, in communities of various kinds, to pursue the high freedoms. And that arrangement is basically what people like me mean when we talk about classical liberalism, right? And so to be very, very clear and to sort of try to forestall one of the annoying objections that I sometimes get, what I'm not saying here is that, if it feels good, do it. Or all lifestyle choices are created equal. I'm not here, truly I'm not, to defend libertinism or moral relativism or any of these things that are often conflated with liberalism, which is not to say that there aren't some people who do defend those things. And when they say the word freedom, that might mean what they have in mind. But that's why defining our terms is so important. And that is not a part of the definition that I'm using. I'm talking specifically about the role of the state, which is a unique entity. It was famously defined as the entity with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in society. This is a uniquely powerful institution because it has the right, it's the only institution in a society that has the right to put a gun to your head and force you to do its bidding. It can take your property, it can even take your life. And therefore, I believe that it needs to be uniquely constrained in its powers and in its legitimate purpose. So that's what I'm arguing. And again, I'm not making a moral claim about every kind of choice being equally valid. And I think that actually pretty much everybody understands this intuitively when it comes to things like adultery, right? We all know that something can be legal, that doesn't mean it's moral. We all recognize that it's wrong, it's just wrong to cheat on your spouse. But very few people would think it's a good idea to empower armed agents of the state to go raiding through people's private bedrooms and hauling away philanderers and throwing them in cages. So something can be legal, that doesn't mean it's moral. And I'm talking about what the law should be. Why am I focusing and sort of fixated on this lower form of freedom when I've already admitted that there is a higher freedom out there? Well, I'm disturbed in recent years by a sort of illiberal turn, especially on the American political right. Conservatives have tended to be defenders for at least the last half century of the idea of individual rights, individual liberties, limited government, personal responsibility. And, but recently we've seen the rise of what is usually often referred to as sort of post-liberal conservatism. I've called it in my writing a will-to-power conservatism. And what this basically says is, we tried your classical liberalism, and we do not like where it got us. And it's time for conservatives to get comfortable with the idea of coercion. We need to be willing to seize control of the reins of state power and to use it against our enemies to bring about the outcomes that we think are compatible with the common good by force if necessary. And I don't want you to think that I'm just sort of making up that or misrepresenting that, I have brought quotes from some writers who are sort of in this camp. They say things like, we need a serious approach to wielding political power. We should be comfortable wielding the levers of state power, and we should emulate the left by using them to reward friends or punish enemies. We should fight with the aim of defeating the enemy and enjoying the spoils. We should use politics to enforce our order and our orthodoxy. We should discredit our opponents and weaken or destroy their institutions. We should wield, quote, regime-level power. And when I talk to people who are articulating this view, which I try to do, to ask them, what are you thinking? Where are you coming from here? One of the things I frequently hear is that they're on the defensive. This is a defensive strategy on our part. And they say things like, the left quite literally wants to destroy us and everything we believe in. And they have no qualms about using state power against us. So if we were to refuse to use the same tactics against them, that would amount to unilateral disarmament. It would be suicide. And so we're not going to do that. We are not going to roll over anymore. It's time to start fighting fire with fire. This is the kind of thing you hear a lot. I was at an event, a lunch event, a few weeks ago, and one of the other participants said something that has really stayed with me. She said, basically, your liberal values may be good in theory, but if we lose the culture war, we are going to end up in the gulags. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening, even if it means, sacrificing the sort of principles of the American founding. And in combination with the other things that I've been hearing in this post-liberal space, it finally occurred to me that the argument, the fear that they're coming to this from is something that says, basically, we're at war, where there are basically two options, two possible outcomes. We can either be the ones in the gulag, or we can be the ones running it. And that's pretty striking, because, who in their right mind would want to be the ones in the gulag if there were any other choice available to them? Well, I actually think the answer is Christ would make that choice. If true freedom, if the highest freedom is to do God's will, then we have to ask ourselves, what is God's will for us? And as the Philos Project has very kindly spent the last few months reminding us through its John 15 project, the answer comes from the Gospel of John. Love one another as I have loved you. And also, no man has greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friend. That is God's will. And actually, that's epitomized by the story of Maximilian Colby, the saint that Sohrab writes very movingly about in the introduction to his book, who died in a Nazi concentration camp after volunteering to take the place of another prisoner who had been randomly selected for death by starvation. And the other prisoner had a wife and children, and Maximilian Colby, being a Catholic priest, did not. And so he said, take me instead, and they did. That is the command that we get from the Gospel of John, love one another as I have loved you. That is how Christ loved us. That is how we are called to love other people. And so I think the idea that we should be trying to defeat and destroy our political and cultural enemies, it's profoundly problematic, actually. And I think that if we actually were ever faced with the choice of which side of the barbed wire of the gulag do you want to be on, that there is only one answer that a Christian should be willing to give, and it's unfortunately not the one that my lunch companion was suggesting she was wanting to make. The good news is, and I think there is really good news here, I don't believe that we are facing that choice, which, do you want to be in the gulags or do you want to be running them? I think in the United States of America, in the 21st century, we are a long way away from gulags, and thank God for that. The reason that I'm sort of optimistic on this front is that, I still believe at the end of the day that we are this is a liberal society, and we are a people who believes in the sorts of things that I was talking about earlier, that it is the government's job. I think that most Americans, by and large, they want a government that will protect the low freedoms, not try to enforce one conception of the high freedoms. and that we'll leave that part to them and their families and their communities. But the only way that we can ensure that, so gulags sort of stay off the table, that we can keep it that way, that this is not a choice that we are ever called to make, because I am not at all confident that I would make the choice I believe Christ would want me to make if I were put in that position. The only way we can sort of keep it off the table is by cherishing the liberal order that we are lucky enough to have inherited, and settling for nothing less. And this is true regardless of whether, of what the other side might try to do to us. We have to be willing to say no. We are not going to play that game. We are not going to play by your rules, because we are called to something higher. And you've pointed that out, beautifully in your talk and in your book. But we have to actually be willing to live as if we believe that's true, including in the way we approach politics. That's my take.
So I have to respond to a few things.
Sure. Go ahead,
The beginning, the first one, which I think has to be squarely faced, is the gulag question. I've never called for putting anyone, God forbid, in gulags. I've named my son after someone who laid down his life, as you said. I've never suggested that. And I think it's a mistake to think that non-liberal political arrangements must necessarily mean lawless ones. There's a distinction between liberal political arrangements, which put the maximization of personal autonomy as the highest good, and to be made between those that reject that conception of society and blend them all with societies that do gulags and camps. It was not historic Christianity that gave rise to gulags and camps. It was modernity. It was secular modernity. And so I think I take issue with the fact of collapsing opposition to a particular account of freedom that we live under, and suggesting that any other account must necessarily mean the gulag or other horrors. Many of the institutions that liberalism claims for itself have roots in pre-liberal times. It's not as if the administrative state, as you know, has existed for millennia, or it's not as if the questions about due process or the fundamental dignity of human beings did not exist in historic Christendom. These are not liberal inventions. They've been kind of appropriated by liberalism. So the collapsing of the two is I think, ahistorical. I have to say about the fact that coercion is held up as necessarily and always a negative thing. It's just unrealistic. You are coerced all the time. Sometimes you're coerced by public actors, as we saw, for example, with COVID, which in some cases they had legitimate reasons to do so, but you're also coerced by all sorts of private actors. When large corporations monitor every minute of their workers' time, they're acting coercively. When a child falls addicted to widespread availability of pornography, which, as you know, nowadays, even beginning in 2010, a child was likely to encounter hardcore pornography before hitting puberty. That's a form of coercion. He's coerced by the ready availability of prurient content, and he's also coerced by his own defective will, which, lacking authoritative supports in a society like ours, leaves him vulnerable to that kind of coercion. So, and you see, as in a liberal society, precisely because man is a religious animal, one orthodoxy or another gets enshrined. We do not live in the society that you describe. We live in a society of prevailing conformism, where we're asked to voice truths that you know and I know are contrary to the truth about, for example, gender. And yet, often using private mechanisms, people are drummed out of the public square for stating those truths. That's a form of coercion as well. So the idea that there won't be coercion ever, that there's some society in which there's no coercion, is a fantasy. There has always been coercion. The question is, who is doing the coercion? Is it some demagogue, some political demagogue? Is it a corporation out for greed? Or is it the institution or institutions and political actors that respect, precisely out of the teaching of the gospel, they respect the fundamental dignity of the human being and recognize what we're really built for, what we're really meant for. So I just think that the idea that coercion is something that can ever be avoided is a fantasy. You are going to be coerced.
Can I respond to that before you move on?
No, apologies. Let me just get through.
After he's done.
And then the question of you offer the definition of freedom from the Catechism, rightly so. But notice it says reasoned. And that idea of reason assumes a human being whose conscience is well-formed, and therefore, and that formation of the conscience, again, is built on that Aristotelian concept that I laid out. It assumes that there have been authorities throughout who have made those corrections to the conscience so that the person has a well-formed conscience and is really fully rational in making their decisions. And again, any definition in the Catechism has to be taken next to the whole of Christian political thought and the Catechism as a whole, which again defines the role of a political actor or leader much more broadly than liberalism does. The teachings of the popes have repeatedly shot down what you would consider freedom of conscience, right? The popes of the 19th century called the idea that you have a freedom of conscience to be a Satanist deliramentum, delirium, folly. That's Christian social thought. The popes have said that the fact that two actors can privately contract on a wage that is exploitative is immoral, because there is a higher law that governs what the goal of society should be with respect to workers and employers. That's rerum novarum. So again, that minimal definition that seemingly came from the Catechism, I have to correct, is not reflective of the whole of Catholic social thought. So again, I cannot persuade Stephanie to come to my side of this debate. But I have to correct the fact that a non-liberal political arrangement or political Christianity must necessarily mean the Gulag. That's frankly offensive, because it traduces historic Christianity and all its contributions to the human spirit. And I have to correct the account that somehow there's a complementarity between her liberal vision and the Catechism as a whole and the Church's social teaching.
Okay, so a couple minutes for you, and then we're going to open it up. We have people here in the audience that I'm sure have questions. Sure. Please.
Sure. Well, one thing is, I think the reason that the Gulag seems like a live issue, and again, I wasn't the one that initially floated this as a thing that that Christians need to be concerned about. It was another Christian who was arguing this.
But it wasn't me.
No. But I'm saying that this is the post-liberal sort of milieu that I'm sort of speaking out against here, that I'm trying to articulate an alternative to. It's because we don't live in a society, if there were unanimity in our society and everybody was a church-going Catholic, then it would be one thing to say we should have laws that reflect the consensus. But that is not the world that we live in. There is a huge amount of diversity of opinions, including about very deeply held basic values. And so any way that you could possibly get to a legal regime that reflected the sort of highest good that you have, the high good, the high freedom, excuse me, that you have been discussing, would necessarily require using force against an unwilling population, right? We are in the minority. I hate to say it, but we are. We are as sort of traditionalist Catholics, as Orthodox Catholics, or Christians even, who see these problems and wish to see them resolved. The solutions that you would propose would require, the revealed preferences of our population, much as I dislike it, are that they like being able to go shopping on Sundays. They like to be able to, to dissolve a marriage. I'm not saying that this is good. I'm saying that this is what the people have revealed, the revealed preferences, what their behavior demonstrates that they support. And so in order to pass laws that implement the regime you're talking about would be to impose your will on people who don't agree with you. That's the kind of coercion that I'm talking about here, and this is why we end up. This is the way that we end up in conversations about gulags, because we're talking about the entity with a right to put a gun to your head and force you to do what it wants, having to then do that thing, put a gun to your head if you don't agree. So that's the first piece. On the idea that there's always coercion in society, I admit that. But there has to be, this is why I tried really hard to draw the fine distinction in the language here. There has to be a way to talk about the kind of coercion that isn't just temptation to sin, the kind of thing, the kind of non-freedom that comes from temptation to sin versus the kind of non-freedom when some external force is coming to you and saying, you will do my bidding whether I like it or not. We have to be able to draw that distinction. And we're always going to be in a world where there is temptation to sin, where we are susceptible to addiction, because this is a fallen world. But we have some control over the legal institutions that we build in terms, and over the amount of power that we give the state to exercise that other kind of coercion against us. And then the third thing, the historical matter, I thought it was very interesting and again, useful, valuable, to hear you say that you thought Christianity sort of came into its own after the Constantinian Revolution. I would just note the flip side of that is that the earliest church, for the first several hundred years of the existence of the church, at the time of the apostles, at the time of the church fathers, the early church fathers, there was never an attempt to seize worldly power and to establish a kingdom on earth. That was never what they were about. So I think there's an equally sort of strong argument to be made that this direction is a perversion of the earliest, Christian history.
That the church has never, as you know, Constantine and Charlemagne, their figures appear on the portico of St. Peter's Basilica. That tells you an image of church and civilization encompassing each other and not radically at odds. But I do want to say the point that millions of people are against us, and therefore that's something that we should grapple with. We should grapple with it, but at some point it becomes a kind of a tyranny of the present, or tyranny of the practical, where, as you again, the kind of Christian and classical tradition urge the primacy of the speculative. We have to start with theory, right? And if theory is right, if St. Thomas, in saying that private exhortation cannot lead to virtue, and therefore what's needed is a ruler or a people that collectively use inducements, including penalties, to lead people to virtue. And that's the basic Aristotelian teaching in the ethics, which then gets incorporated in the virtue ethics of St. Thomas and kind of the church's teaching. If that's the case, if that's true, then we have to work from there. And so it might mean retreat. It might mean that we reach that conclusion, and that's correct. And we may still have to retreat because conditions are X, Y, and Z. Or it might be that we have to evangelize the culture harder, or use a combination of evangelization and political action. But that's beside the point. The first thing that we have to agree on is what is the church's teaching, or what is Christian teaching, with respect to how to form a population. And that's what I read at the beginning. Right, that people need to be induced to virtue not just by mere private exhortation, but by the action of the papal as a whole, therefore the state.
It's fascinating. I want to just do this all day. There's like a philosophical side. There's even a historical side to this, but I'm going to stop. I want to open it up. We have some smart people here in the Philos offices that we'd like to get questions from. If you are one of those smart people, we'd love you to come up here to the microphone and ask your question. We don't have a lot of time. We have maybe 10 minutes. So please be succinct, and our speakers will do the same. Maybe.
I'll be succinct. I promise. I promise.
I can't do it either.
My question is for Sohrab. Couldn't you argue that God's original design for us, by giving us free will, was to choose to live a moral life rather than having it prescribed by an earthly government? Doesn't that choice make living a moral life more fulfilling and the subsequent salvation much more valuable?
Before you answer, some other smart person, we'll probably have time for another question. Please take the position. Thank you, Shannon. Sohrab.
So, it's absolutely true that God wants our free choice. That's absolutely true. But a free choice made in response to government authority is no less free. In fact, government is instituted before the fall. Right? There is a government between Adam and Eve, as St. Augustine says. It's a sort of prototypical. In other words, historic Christianity is not doesn't stand for the idea that government is a response to the fall. Even in Edenic kind of pre-fall situation, there's a hierarchy of angels and a hierarchy within the human family, and so therefore, that God was okay with that love being shaped authoritatively and lovingly by government, right? The church does not teach, again, that there was no government before the fall, and it's a result of the fall that we have it. It's it's part of the right ordering of the universe, order being the first law of the cosmos, as the Thomist A.G. Sertalange says. Order is always the first law of the cosmos, and that includes even before our first ancestors made this kind of catastrophic sin.
You have anything to add on that? No. Next question. Yes, sir.
Yes, this is very, I love this very much. In Peter's letter, he says that the purpose of government is to punish evil and affirm what is good, right? And so there's a sense of the common good, and I'm curious where is for you, Stephanie, where the line is on that, like the common good. I mean, the common good could be clean water and roads, but it also could be a limitation on pornography or forms of violence, you know, where it's important for the city to, you know, here in this city we have a rising problem with mental health issues, right? So there's a common good that is going to restrict people's behavior, and so how do you articulate in like where that line shows up in that lower, particularly in the lower freedom range?
Well, I would be curious to know what the government should do about, you know, a mental health problem in a large city, for example. And because I know we're limited on time, I'll say that I wrote a very long essay for America Magazine about 4 years ago about exactly this issue, libertarianism and the common good, and can they be reconciled? And actually, I argue that really, if you talk to libertarians, you'll find us, and not just Christian libertarians, I mean many of my atheist colleagues and friends, will be saying things like, why do we support individual liberty and minimal government? Well, we think that that creates the conditions under which human beings can flourish. We think that it will lead to things like material abundance, free markets leading to material abundance. We think that it will lead to things like peace between nations. We think that it will lead to, you know, almost by definition, justice for all, because you have equal rights under the law. We think that it is going to be helpful for sort of forestalling the types of violence in the streets that you are seeing now in some parts of the world. When you have people in close proximity who have very, you know, deeply held different values, and if they think that their only option is to impose those values and force everybody else to live as a monolith, that's going to, you know, be much more likely to lead to a conflagration. Whereas if you believe that you can live side by side with somebody who disagrees with you and be tolerant of that, even if they're making choices that really, really bother you and that you consider to be immoral, then you're more likely to have peace. So the types of things that are the results of a free society, a liberal order, actually end up being exactly the kinds of things that the church talks about when the church talks about the common good.
Are you sure, though? Because, yeah, I mean, there are many situations in which leaving private actors to do as they will obviously hurts the common good. And so you need kind of, again, an authoritative, loving hand to take care of a problem. So, for example, since Luke brought up mental health, that's an issue where it's a recent thing that we've had this kind of, we're buffeted by lots of mentally ill people, usually in combination with addiction, because it came after a process of deinstitutionalization where people said that the autonomy of the mentally ill is a very high good, if not the highest good, and for them, and therefore they shouldn't be, that the laws allowing involuntary hospitalization or inpatient treatment for the mentally ill were made very rigorous and difficult, a high bar for the state to pass. But if you look at those people, they're miserable. They're addicted on the streets. I see them in Manhattan all the time. And even if there were problems in the inpatient treatment system, and we did definitely consign people and threw them away, and that's not good either. But we've swung to the other extreme where we leave them to their own misery because we've made it so hard. So that's an example of how the vision that you laid out of just letting everyone do as they might without any kind of guidance had led to a very concrete problem of people who themselves suffer. They shoot up on the trains, they dirty themselves, and that's no human dignity there. So that's one example where easily you can see how the common good is served by limiting the individual choice of people, because you recognize the reality that that person doesn't have the capacity to choose rightly. Again, freedom is, as the Catechism says, is a reasoned decision, but if that's impaired, then they need help from the rest of us.
So the answer seems to be, to the question of what can the state do about the problem of mental illness in a city, seems to be we should make it much easier to lock them up against their will, which,
treatment.
Well, as you said a moment ago, there were a lot of abuses. Before these policies were changed, there were a lot of abuses then, and that gets to the point of, in a fallen world where nobody has sort of perfect information, the state is always going to have to, there's no guarantee that the state's going to make the right choice. It didn't make the right choice before. Perhaps it's not making the right choice now, but there's a sort of prudential judgment that has to be made about how to approach a problem like that. That's fine. I mean, I just think that the more power you give to the state, the more suffering, the more ability it has to then impose suffering on everyone. When you leave a problem to individuals and family groups, community groups, associations, business associations, whatever the case may be, you have the ability to try out different solutions and see what works, as opposed to the state which says, this is the answer. We have absolutely no way of knowing if our answer is actually the right answer. Let's try it and see how bad things go.
But if the family wants to commit a mentally ill person for inpatient treatment, and the law has been made so onerous to be able to prove that this person cannot care for themselves and refuses to seek the treatment that they need because it's a symptom of their mental illness, then the version you even laid out the family isn't as a subsidiary group can't do its work. So again, you see how.
But what I just mean is that that's not liberalism versus illiberalism. We're just talking about a menu of options, and government has to make a prudential choice, and the evidence might point in one direction or another, or maybe we need to scale back or whatever, and that's fine. That's governing. But that, I don't think, is in any way, it doesn't undermine the case for the liberal order.
Okay, but it just shows you that the common good does often clash with living people up to their own. In some cases, it's a very obvious case of the mentally ill. There is the need for some sort of authoritative guidance that's loving because it's helping them because they're not capable of helping themselves. And there are other scenarios like this, like, for example, penury wages. Why did Pope Leo the 13th issue Rerum Novarum, the encyclical on capital and labor? Because there were conditions in which workers were being paid such low wages they were in a state of utter abjection. And so he said, no, just because someone freely contracts to a exploitative wage doesn't make that
just. It doesn't make it morally right.
Doesn't make it morally.
But that doesn't mean that there's justification then for the state to step in. Again, draw the distinction between something being immoral.
Are you sure that Rerum Novarum would support any number of measures in order to address the injustice? Because the Catholic Church believes in the role of public power to address injustice. So he did not leave it up to private contract. He didn't, because his whole teaching is based on the idea that the state promotes the common good.
Subsidiarity says that problems should be solved at the closest level to the individual as possible. This is a major part of Catholic social teaching that has its roots in Rerum Novarum. And so the idea is individuals, families, community groups should try to solve a problem. If they can't, look to the local government. If it can't, look to the state, look to the nation, so on and so forth.
But in conditions of industrial capitalism, almost every kind of problem of this kind becomes a global or at least a national problem. But I don't object to subsidiarity. I'm just saying that if the family and the community can't solve it, Pope Leo XIII would have no problem using government power to ensure that labor relations are just.
Well, I think that, again, pointing to a problem, saying something is unjust, does not itself establish, therefore pass a law, especially pass a law in Washington. It doesn't follow. You can say we have identified a problem. Now let's look at what are our options for solving it, and let's always start at the lowest level, at a private solution, at a voluntary solution. And it should be. And I think, and again, my piece for America Magazine, I think, lays this out in much more detail. It's been a while since I wrote it, but Rerum Novarum really does it back up the idea that the state is the last resort. I mean, it goes on and very eloquently about how associations of workers and neighborhood groups are the ones who should be solving these problems. And then it's not saying that there's never a role for state power. I'm not saying it is, but that's the last resort. I mean, that is Rerum Novarum as well.
Well, I want to be respectful of time. I want to give you a couple of minutes to, or maybe 1 minute, just sort of summarize and close out, both of you, and then we'll wrap it up.
You want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, the main thing I just would say is that, you know, it's, and I appreciate that in your opening remarks you did not sort of succumb to the temptation to accuse me of either being a libertine or a moral relativist, or saying that our society faces no moral problems, because of course I have written a lot about how, you know, all those things, you know, I just many of my libertarian friends and colleagues maybe are libertines in a way that I'm not, and I think they're wrong. But again, I think that there's a lot of space between saying there's a problem and therefore saying we need the state to step in to solve it, especially given that, you know, when you sort of step back and think about what does it mean to pass a law? Well, it empowers an agent of the state to put a gun to people's heads, to seize their property, to potentially take their lives. That we should be very, very reluctant about authorizing the state to do that, especially in an enormous and diverse society where not everybody is in agreement about the sort of underlying values that you would be seeking to use the state to enforce.
Sohrab, I have nothing else to say that if you found this discussion interesting, and I appreciate Stephanie's contribution and Robert's wise and gentle moderation, that if you found it useful and interesting, please do read The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos, out now from Penguin Random House. And the coolest thing about that is that this is just one chapter of the book, What is Freedom For? There's 11 others, I think. So if you like this, there's a lot more. What I love about this conversation, I'll say this in closing, is that, as you mentioned, the John 15 challenge that we've been trying to do, challenging Christians, is that you guys both, you know, arriving at different conclusions, brought this back to first principles, right? This is really what this is coming down to. And that's the kind of conversation that I want to see in this country in 2021. I'm grateful to those of our audience who joined us. I'm grateful to you, Stephanie, and also to Sohrab. Buy Sohrab's book. It's chock full of all kinds of good stuff. And stay tuned for more from the Philos Project.